Hi everyone. Today I'd like to talk about a very special Interpol case of Alan Stevenson, a British Australian national who was arrested in Prague last year. He spent several months in detention, and it sparked an investigation into Interpol abuse. So this is where it becomes very interesting. Obviously, this is something that's been happening for a long time. I've been talking about it for a decade. But in Alan's case, he was detained for 4 months. He spoke about the horrendous conditions that he faced in Czech prison. And it was on the basis, allegedly, of debt that he'd left in Qatar when he left the country. He'd worked there previously. But this debt didn't exist, actually. Alan had cleared everything and moved on with his life. He was never contacted and never told about any debt that he might have. And despite being quite easy to find on the internet, on LinkedIn and so on, was never contacted. And yet cases were taken against him in Qatar. And for bounced checks, apparently. He didn't have an opportunity to defend himself, and a conviction in absentia was secured against him. Now, it was on this basis that Qatar authorities, ultimately coming from a bank there, reported Alan to Interpol under the category of fraud. Now, this triggered his arrest when he was travelling to Prague, and triggered 4 months in detention, followed by the actions that Alan's about to take, in fact. One interesting thing is the Czech authorities have come back and ruled, or the courts have actually ruled, that the arrest was unlawful, that the Interpol notice was unlawful, and this was a breach of human rights. So this is probably the first time that aside from the United Kingdom, that a European country has come back with such an official ruling that can then be used to take actions in other courts, such as a European Court of Human Rights. I'm reading an article now. It says a spokesperson for the Czech Justice Ministry said it was concerned by the disproportionate number of red notices issued by some countries on allegations of bank fraud, but that the Czech authorities had no control over Interpol's database. Now, this raises the very real issue of trusting Interpol as an international authority on crime, an international sharing agency. Now, these arrests are being facilitated by countries because of their trust for Interpol itself, not because of their trust of the end user of Interpol, and that end user is China, Russia, Egypt, Turkey. Would we trust these countries to give us correct information, and would we act on that in a normal law enforcement sense? Now, the answer is no. But if they run it through the Interpol database, of which they're members, they're member countries, they make their donations, they run it via Interpol's database, and it's on the basis of our trust for Interpol that we're making these arrests, like Alan Stevenson. Now, this is happening, as the Czech authorities have noticed, with increased frequency. And for the purpose, when we're talking about banks, this is for the purpose of extortion, intimidation, or harassment. Now, in Alan's case in particular, he didn't owe any money. He was never contacted to advise him that he owed money. If he had been contacted, he would have made those corrections with them directly. Instead, they sought recourse through Interpol's database, which led to his ultimate incarceration and this subsequent investigation. When it comes to banks, we're facing their own fraud. We're facing situations where a bank is deliberately seeking the arrest of a former customer for the purpose of requesting that they pay the bank money, whether or not they owe it. Now, in this case, it could have been used for extortion. I've had several other clients who have been detained in European countries on the basis of Qatari bank-issued Interpol notices. Now, Alan's case is extreme because he absolutely owed nothing, but in other cases, people had owed smaller amounts. In fact, they'd been trying to negotiate with the banks directly, trying to enter payment plans, and the banks just weren't having it. They simply thought it would be easier to go to Interpol and ask Interpol to arrest this person in Europe and hold them until they could come up with an agreed repayment plan for the bank. Now, if that's not extortion, I don't know what is. But ultimately, as I was saying, this does come down to the fact that countries are trusting Interpol. If Interpol asks them to arrest someone, they will arrest that person. They will detain them pending extradition proceedings. Now, 4 months is around average for someone to be detained, and that is the duration that Alan was detained. 4 months is average for when an extradition request is made against that party in a country like Czech. And the proceedings take usually around 4 months to conclude. And in that 4 months, both countries will submit, Alan, for example, would submit his evidence that he shouldn't be extradited, and Qatar should submit their evidence of why he should be. Now, that whole process takes around about 4 months if it doesn't go to an elongated trial. So in this case it didn't, and the Czech authorities ruled that Alan should be released and that his initial arrest was a violation because no crime had been committed. But what's happened is we're trusting Interpol and we're subjecting innocent people to months of detention. And now 4 months, like I said, is average, but it can easily go to 9 to 12 months if it happens to go all the way to trial. And at the end, he might be found innocent and he might be released. Now, what happens to that person? They're supposed to just forget about the detention. They're supposed to forget about the human rights violation. They're supposed to forget about being detained in a foreign location like, can you imagine, Ukraine or Czech, being detained for months on end on the basis of a debt that you don't even owe. So again, if Qatar approached law enforcement in England or in America or in Czech even and said, we'd like you to arrest this person because we think that they had a bank debt, what would happen in that scenario? Law enforcement would tell them, I'm sorry, you'll have to move right along. We're not taking this seriously. Debt is not a crime. You can't misuse police forces. But when it's routed through Interpol, we seem to take a completely different approach. Arrest the person, detain them, put them through an abusive legal process that could cost them tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and lost income, complete loss of employment. It's very difficult for people who have been wrongfully detained, for months on end in a foreign jurisdiction to keep their job if they work for someone else. The professional, the reputation, and the attack on that reputation. I've had other clients like Pancho Campo, a Spanish national, who suffered severe criticism in the media because of his wrongful Interpol arrest. It affected his business, his ability to give speeches and arrange all sorts of different international events that he was doing. Now, it took him 10 years to get a final ruling from Interpol that actually he shouldn't have been on there in the first place, that it was an abusive notice as well. Same with Alan Stevenson. I mean, detained for 4 months. He's been all over the international media. Of course, that affects the way that people perceive Alan and others like him. And sorry, I'm just going to read a couple of messages here. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Habitual abusers of Interpol should be suspended from requesting red notices. Yes, they should. And what we're seeing here is Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, Russia, China, and the UAE, Middle Eastern countries in particular. And we've even seen some from South American countries. But what we're seeing is repeat abusers, absolutely repeat abusers. Qatar and the UAE in particular are countries that I've dealt with for the past 12 years, in fact, removing people from Interpol on the basis of their wrongful notices in the first place. Now, Interpol should be seeing this themselves. Interpol can see how many notices are being issued and how many are being removed based on the fact that they shouldn't have been issued in the first place. And what are they doing to encourage countries like Qatar, like Russia, China, UAE, to stop misusing the database, essentially? There's no sanctions. We've called for sanctions. I think Interpol is making some internal changes in perhaps, the information that they give to people when applying for a removal. They might be a little bit more specific than they used to be. They're taking it seriously, but they're not changing anything. So they're only taking it seriously from their end in a sense that they're explaining and justifying themselves. But have they issued sanctions against countries that are continuous abusers, like the UAE, like Egypt, like countries who put journalists, list journalists as being terrorists and debtors as being fraudsters? This is the kind of abuse that Interpol should be disallowing. So there have been several documentaries actually over the past 5-6 years that investigate what could possibly be compelling Interpol to be so flexible with accepting their notices and with withholding criticism of countries who are frequent abusers. And what they've suggested is, number one, the financial contributions that these countries have made. Number two, these countries have their own representatives on Interpol's board. We had a director was from China. In fact, he got arrested back in China. But yes, we had Emiratis on the board. We've got Qataris. We've got Chinese. It's very, very difficult when the organisation itself is run by the very countries who we're talking about abusing. Then we have the financial incentives coming from all of these countries. We've had 50 million maybe from UAE, another 10 million from Qatar. And we have these joint projects that are happening all the time. And for example, collaborations, say the UAE and Qatar might be collaborating with Interpol on specific projects like betting fixing and that sort of thing. But of course it's valuable. We want the input from the UAE, we want the input from Qatar on a crime fighting basis, we want information about terrorist groups. But that doesn't mean that they can't stand up to them and say, okay, we have this reciprocal arrangement, that's great, but you just have to stop doing this. It's just about setting boundaries, and Interpol hasn't set boundaries. Interpol has avoided accountability, avoided legal liability, avoided being held responsible, and avoided having to compensate victims of abuse. So this is why Alan Stevenson's next steps are really important to making Interpol more accountable in the future. He's reviewing his legal options at the moment. This was clearly an abusive case. He has suffered, not only financially, but suffered emotionally, and his mother, in fact, died while he was in prison as well. So there's a lot of, very sad effects that this detention has had on his life. So in taking further action against Interpol itself, but also the bank that issued this, I think is a really important step. I think that's all, but yes, I think, a class action suit is something that is being explored now in the United States, and I think we have another client taking action in the US about his Interpol notice. Fortunately, it didn't lead to his detention. It only led to some questioning in the United States, but that's because the US doesn't really take Interpol notices seriously, so that should also tell us something. And we have another American client who was subject to an Interpol Red Notice issued by a hotel tycoon in Dubai, simply for a personal matter. So he's looking to take action as well. It's very important that people group together, and certainly you can contact us to discuss those potential next steps, because we are looking at action against the individuals who put people on the database, and that could be a bank, it could be a business partner, it could be anyone really, a vindictive person of the past, or in some cases like Egypt, listing journalists as terrorists, that sort of thing. That can be dealt with in a different way again. But if there is an individual on the other end of what's turned into an Interpol notice, or if there's an institution, a bank, or a private company, they could potentially be liable for their actions. So that's something for them to keep in mind when they click their fingers and put people on Interpol. Nowadays, it's possible to seek justice internationally. And as far as Interpol itself, we're taking steps to make them accountable, and therefore they're going to have to make the countries who subscribe to their service, their members, they're going to have to become accountable to Interpol. But now it's really important that that Interpol is seen for what it is. It's not, the world should know that someone being reported to Interpol does not by any means mean that they're a big bad criminal, an international fugitive, they shouldn't be trusted and they're a fraudster. Of course, there are those people, but there are so many Interpol there's so many Interpol abusive notices now that that it no longer holds that prestige or respect that it used to. In fact, it's nothing more than a messaging system. But okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'll keep you updated certainly on this case. And if anyone else has any more questions on Interpol or any class actions against banks or anything like that, anyone who's been affected by a wrongful Interpol notice, please get in touch and we'll try to help you. So thanks very much for tuning in, everyone. Have a good day.